Peer and Jimmy fell helplessly in love. Peer gave him a diary for his birthday and pasted into it the following quote: "James, it is a law of the mind that that which is not experienced dies." On the opposite page she wrote, "And the child, James Dean, grew and waxed strong, full of wisdom, and the grace of God was in him." James, if you are not writing in another, then write in this book, even if it is only a line, once a day, fact, fiction, fancy, but do it. Because he wasn't Catholic, Peer's mother was determined to keep them apart. She engineered Peer's engagement and marriage to singer Vic Damone. Years later, Peer tragically committed suicide after confessing that Jimmy was the only man she had ever loved. Due to the tremendous response to East of Eden, the studio immediately agreed to Jimmy's next film, Rebel Without a Cause, for director Nick Ray.
When I went out to New York to spend the week with him and my son to see how he would relate to the kid younger than himself, he had resolved, well, when we made the handshake agreement on 15 pages, he said, "Look, I want to make a film with you. I want to make this film with you."
To me, it seemed that Nick Ray was another rebel in that his ideas didn't match everybody else's, but he and Jimmy seemed to get along fine together in that respect.
In his diary, Jimmy wrote, "We'll go to Nick's tonight. Constructive evening. Script advanced. Await further revisions. I feel that we will make a good movie. I am inspired towards its dramatic importance. Unity." This entry tells us two things: Jimmy's crucial input into the script of Rebel and his growing trust of Nick Ray, the director. Jimmy worked closely with writer Stuart Stern and director Nick Ray to create the character and the concept of Rebel as a new type of movie. Rebel would give a face and a voice to the thoughts and feelings of a generation that up to that time had no voice.
I think that you can't just go around proving things and pretending like you're tough.
Yeah, that's right.
You can't, even though you gotta,
Right.
You look a certain way, you can't.
That's right. You're absolutely.
You
You're
feel.
absolutely right.
Are you not listening to me?
In his diary of Thursday, March 10th, he talks about Natalie Wood, his love interest in Rebel. Natalie, accident with girlfriend and Dennis Hopper in Laurel Canyon. Car collision on Lookout Mountain. For Natalie, possible concussion. This incident persuaded Nick Ray and Jimmy that she could play a troubled teenager and wasn't just a sweet child star. He ends another entry poetically with, "Art is like making love. Making love is already an art." Rarely have actor, part, and subject been as perfectly matched as James Dean's Jim Stark in Rebel Without a Cause. The film doesn't simply depict teenage behavior, it validates it.
And it seemed to me that when Jimmy and I were on the cliffside, Stuart Stern gave me one of the best lines.
Why do we do this?
You got to do something. Now, don't you?
You got to do something, don't you? That wasn't just the 50s. That was pervasive in the 50s, but that's teenage, always. Here we are, now what?
The 50s were a dynamic, tortured time in America. There was the blacklist going on. There was the McCarthy period. There was the Korean War. All these made for young boys, young men coming to manhood thinking, how do I resist it? How do I argue against what's happening? How am I a rebel?
Due to an overlooked clause in a contract with CinemaScope, the film, which began in black and white, had to be reshot in color, which helped to separate it from the usual teenage exploitation movies. Jimmy was always testing people to see how they reacted to him.
Day of the wardrobe test, which was really the first day I met him, he came up to me and I sort of, like that, and then he hit me in the stomach. And I thought, yeah, that's the kind of thing he would do. And I thought, what is this? So I hit him back. And he said, oh, you know, and he walked away.
Every once in a while, he'd bring me a paper cup of water and say, here, and I'd go, why did he do that?
But he didn't have any tolerance for people who didn't totally respect the art or the craft or the potential of film. And I think he instilled that in everybody, that film was the art form. And I think that all the people in the film, whether it was Dennis Hopper or Natalie or Corey Allen or whoever, they essentially felt turned on, you know, with the potential of what film could be.
Beverly Long, Corey Allen, Jimmy Dean.
How do you do? How you doing?
Hey, Beverly, what's that like, kid?
It's very cold out there.
You all in there? All right.
I figured
It's nice. Corey, back up.
Crazy, huh?
Ooh, Okay, Frank. Pull away. Dennis, you want to get in there once? Between the two of them. Hey, watch the shadow, Corey. Back off. See the shadow on the right. Okay, Jack. Greenwich. Change it down.
I said I think he would have been great in Easy Rider. He could have played Captain America, I think. Or he could have played Jack Nicholson. He could have played anything. I would like to have seen him direct, because that's what he really was heading for and wanted to do.
Jimmy's performance as the charismatic, alienated teenager would transform post-war culture. He's the first 10 seconds in the Big Bang of pop culture. After him came rock and roll, Elvis, the Beatles, hippies, punks, and grunge.
We could have been in Jimmy's gang. I mean, he was one of us. He was a normal person going through all the frustrations of growing up as a teenager.
Dad, stand up for me. Stand up!
You want to kill your own father?
By the time Rebel was finished, Jimmy had gone from unknown to movie star on the strength of his performance in East of Eden. It was only 9 months since he had arrived in Hollywood. Jimmy was an artist, pure and simple. When he wasn't acting, he was sculpting, taking photographs, here with friend Martin Landau, or playing his bongos. He loved bullfighting. Jimmy saw the bullfight as a metaphor for the urgency and risk of his own life. He played matador with New York taxicabs and hung bullfight posters on his wall. He drew and painted bullfighters. He also made this remarkable stop-action animated film, which was found among his belongings after he died. Jimmy's other obsession, auto racing, was natural for a boy from Indiana, home of the Indianapolis 500. Fast cars allowed him to indulge his desire to live life on the edge. But it wasn't the only aspect that appealed to him. He was good enough to win against world champion drivers like Phil Hill.
He was a good driver. He was not a daredevil. He was strictly, could have been probably one of the top race car drivers of the day, because he was not out there to race just to have fun. He drove his race car out there to win.
He would bring pictures, like 8x10s, and it was like he was going to show you dirty postcards or something. He'd say, want to see some pictures? And you'd go, well, I don't know, because I don't know what you're going to show me. And then he'd go, see this? And he would show himself, like in Palm Springs, at one of those
That
races in Palm Springs.
Right.
And he would just, he'd say, and he'd describe the entire race to you.
It was written into Jimmy's contract that he would give up racing during the production of Giant. Giant was an epic film based on the best-selling book by Edna Ferber. It starred Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson. The movie was directed by George Stevens, who did not believe in collaboration with actors, as had Maverick directors Nick Ray and Elia Kazan. On the set, when not acting, Jimmy shot these 16mm home movies. He was particularly interested in filming the real cowboys who were wrangling on the film as part of his preparation for The Left-Handed Gun, which he was considering for his next movie. But fate would intervene. Paul Newman would later star in this film. In what would later become a trademark of Jimmy's acting style, his quiet intensity and physical mannerisms contrast with the slickness and dishonesty of the other characters.
I'm a rich boy. Me, I'm gonna have more money than you ever thought you could have. You and all the rest of you stinking sons of Benedicts.
Leslie, you go out in the house. Take the women with you.
Jack, we're real glad you struck him. Now you go on along home.
Oh, my, you sure did look pretty, Miss Leslie. You always did look pretty. Just pretty now, good enough to eat.
Wait a minute. Boy, take it easy. Take it easy, boy. Hey, come on. Wait a minute.
Oh, you Tessie, Vic. Tessie is no cook.
Jimmy adored Elizabeth Taylor, but like his character in the movie, he couldn't stand Rock Hudson. Despite their mutual dislike, Hudson confided his admiration for Jimmy's intensity. When I looked in his eyes when we were doing the scene together, I got a concentration and an illusion of reality that I'd never gotten from any other performer. All art has poetry at its center. French director Francois Truffaut tried to define it when he noted that James Dean acts beyond what he is saying. This was Jimmy's gift, that behind his idea of character was that words alone are merely suggestions of what we really think or feel.
Well, Dean is immensely important because he's completely unlike everyone else. I mean, the general pattern of actors is to give you huge emotions, and Dean is one of the very few who understood that a repressed emotion is the only fascinating emotion, and that if you don't give it up, you preserve your mystery.
All his acting underscored this. All his behavior indicated emotions and thoughts that lay beneath the surface.
I like you, too. I guess you're about the best-looking gal we've seen around here in a long time. I think. Prettiest than I think I've seen down here.
Why, thank you, Jack. That's a very nice compliment. And I'm going to tell my husband I've met with your approval.
Oh, well, no, I wouldn't do that. I mean, well, no,
In September, during filming, Jimmy bought a new race car, a Porsche Spyder 550. Ironically, he made this prophetic highway safety film.
We probably have a great many young people watching our show tonight, and for their benefit, I'd like your opinion about fast driving on the highway. Do you think it's a good idea?
a good point. I used to fly around quite a bit, you know. I took a lot of unnecessary chances on the highways. And I started racing, and now I drive on the highways. I'm extra cautious, because no one knows what they're doing. Half the time, you don't know what this guy's going to do with that one. On a track, there are a lot of men who spend a lot of time developing rules and ways of safety. And I find myself being very cautious on the highway. I don't have the urge to speed on the highway. People say racing is dangerous, but I'll take my chances on the track any day than on a highway. Well, Gig, I think I'd better take off.
Oh, wait a minute, Jimmy. One more question. Do you have any special advice for the young people who drive?
Take it easy driving. The life you might save might be mine.
I said, why are you trying to, race and do all that kind of threatening stuff? He says, I just feel like I have to conquer death. I said, well, you can't.
Immediately after finishing his part in Giant, Jimmy was literally off to the races. On the morning of September 30th, 1955, he surprised George Barris, who'd been preparing his Porsche, with the news that he wanted to personally drive the car to the races. So they took the car off the trailer, and Jimmy, with his mechanic, Rolf Wutherick, beside him, drove off. Following in another car were friends Bill Hickman and photographer Sanford Roth, who took these photographs. They stopped once along the way. At twilight, a Ford sedan, not seeing the silver Porsche, turned into the lane Jimmy was traveling in. Jimmy attempted to avoid the car, but they collided. Rolf was thrown clear. Jimmy died instantly.
The car was his wheels, and he felt it, and it was not his fault. The accident or him getting killed was not because he was reckless, not because he was speeding. I mean, 65, 70 miles an hour is not speeding on that kind of highway with that kind of a car. So the accident that killed him was just destined. It was meant to be.
Tragically, earlier that morning, Jimmy had breakfast with his father, beginning a reconciliation between them. The time for this had sadly run out.
I got the bullets!
Can't help it, son. You did everything a man could.
Help me.
Even though his father still lived in California and Jimmy died there, James Dean's body was brought back to what had always been home, Fairmount, Indiana. The state police had to be called in to control the crowds of fans that had shown up. Only East of Eden had been released. He had been in Hollywood only 18 months. To spend a day in his hometown of Fairmount is to understand how much his growing up here influenced his character. As a country boy who went to a big city, he understood what it was like to be an outsider and misunderstood.
He was, in a sense, a bright, poetic, sensitive farm boy. He could race you with a car, but he couldn't understand this other kind of racing and lying and avarice and greed and stuff.
It's tragic that he died at a young age, but he filled a lot of dreams, for the years he was here.
Well, I think that the unknown part of him, the magnetic part, had to do also with the roles he played. All radical revolutionary roles against society. And at that time, where kids were just coming out of the idea of being slaves to their parents, and I think Jimmy came at exactly the right time. Historically, it was extraordinary. And so people saw him as an example, as a role model.
Jimmy had been dead for more than a month when his most famous film, Rebel Without a Cause, opened in Hollywood in November of 1955. Warner Brothers, convinced that his death meant disaster at the box office, expected the worst. But then something amazing happened. His death triggered a frenzy. Within a year, there would be over 4 million dues-paying members of fan clubs. His inconsolable fans treasured anything that would connect them with their dead hero. Fragments of the shriveled aluminum from his crashed Porsche were being sold like pieces of the true cross. People are often surprised to learn that he was nominated for an Academy Award for his portrayal of Cal in East of Eden, and a year later, after Giant was released, for Jet Rink. James Dean's genius was to fuse the contradictions of vulnerability and strength within his own nature. By merging the opposing qualities of his two screen idols, he created a unique acting style of great complexity.
The reason that I'm going to make it is because I've got Marlon Brando on this hand saying, screw you. And I've got Montgomery Clift in this hand saying, help me. And somewhere in between is James Dean.
I just wish he had got successful a little slower. He might still be alive.
His untimely death helped create the myth, but it's the lasting nature of what he stands for that keeps James Dean relevant today. He is the poet of what it's like to be young, lost, or alone. We will never get closer to James Dean than the mesmerizing roles he played in his movies. The complicated farm boy in East of Eden, the young Jet Rink in Giant, and most of all, the Rebel Without a Cause. When we think of Cal Trask, Jim Stark, or Jet Rink, we think of James Dean. He blurred the distinction between actor and role. We believe his characters implicitly because you can never catch him acting. His total identification with his roles gave him the uncanny ability to transfer his emotions directly to the audience. And in the end, that's what an actor's job really is, to portray publicly what everyone else feels privately. Whether you were awkward or graceful, he made you feel good about being yourself. We never got to see James Dean grow old. Fate ensured that we would always have him preserved in our memories at 24, perfect in his innocence, sensitivity, and defiance. The graveyard where Jimmy is buried is located only a minute from the farm where he grew up. He had passed it hundreds of times on his motorcycle. He had left his small town to seek fame and returned to it for the final time to become a legend. He remains an enigma, and this is the source of his fascination. A figure of sensuality and repression, fantasy and truth, lost boy and immortal star. James Dean is a reflection of America's secret ideal of itself, a combination of adolescent dreamer and rebel. In the years since that fateful day in 1955, James Dean has become larger than life, an American icon. James Dean wrote in high school, "If a man can bridge the gap between life and death, if he can live on